Good evening and welcome to this week's edition of Behind the Headlines, and we are on the eve of a general election. After weeks of campaigning, the British people, including ourselves, get the chance to vote to determine who will form our next government on Thursday, the 4th of July. And in this programme, we'll be discussing why the issue of Israel and the Jewish people are so significant in this election. If we look at the Bible, when we look at the promises God made to Abraham in Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 to 3, he says, "I will bless those who bless you, and I will curse those who curse you." Whoever forms our next government and how they treat Israel and the Jewish people will be paramount to whether this nation is blessed or whether it's cursed, whether we live in spiritual darkness or whether we live in the light. This is why our vote tomorrow is so crucial. I can't believe after weeks of campaigning that we are now finally here on the eve of a general election 2024, where this election is so important to determine not only the future destiny of Great Britain, but also our strategic relationship with Israel, which of course we know has huge biblical undercurrent underpinning it.
Absolutely, Simon, and I can't believe that it's almost 5 years ago since the last general election, nor that in that time frame we've already had 3 prime ministers. So we're about to have our 4th prime minister likely within the space of 5 years, which is a truly mind-boggling statistic. But here we are, and it is incredibly important that we consider, along with all of the other policies and stuff that we have talked about on previous programs in various ways, what the relationship of our country will be to the nation of Israel in line with individual parties. What are they coming from? Where are they coming from? Absolutely. What is their take on this?
And it's also so important as well because the UK is one of Israel's strongest allies in Europe, and that partnership has grown, particularly in the post-Brexit era.
I feel it's grown since just in the past 14 years. I've lived here 21 years now, and when I first arrived in 2003, there was definite anti-Israel sentiment that I felt was prevalent throughout. And I do feel that things have begun to improve, that things have been on a much better footing for a little while now, and I'm just praying that that will continue.
No, absolutely. So, I mean, when we look at the kind of political issues, we know that Israel's war against Hamas in Gaza will play a huge part in this election, particularly when it comes to the kind of Muslim vote and how the Muslim community, because they are rallying around the Muslim cause. So it will depend on which of our main political parties will cater to their vote, and if they get in, what impact will that have on their foreign policy towards Israel and the Middle East. But let's put general election 2024 in its context. So there was widespread relief amongst the Jewish community back in December 2019 when Boris Johnson beat Jeremy Corbyn, leader of the Labour Party, to become Prime Minister. I mean, this is a time when Jewish people during Friday night dinners or Shabbat dinners were talking or even thinking about making Aliyah, either to Israel or fleeing to the United States because they feared a Labour government. The fact that Jeremy Corbyn, when he was leader of the Labour Party, couldn't even mention the word Israel. He was there honouring Palestinian terrorists with blood on their hands that had murdered Israelis. There was a huge widespread Jew hatred that took hold of the Labour Party under his leadership, forced many Jewish members of parliament effectively to resign from the parliamentary party. Party activists were also faced intimidation and bullying and threats because they were Jewish. And this was very much reflected in the attitudes towards the Jewish community towards Jeremy Corbyn in the last election.
Well, the Jewish News UK reported under the headline Opinion, in this election the Jewish vote is remarkably similar to the UK population. They reported that only 11% of British Jews voted for Corbyn, and it was the lowest level of support for Labour amongst the Jewish community in Labour's long and established history. The Labour Party suffered its worst general election result since 1935, and main political commentators thought it would take the party a generation to recover from what was seen as a total political catastrophe. In the general election, according to the Jewish Institute of Policy Research, 61% voted out of British Jewry voted for Boris Johnson and the Conservative Party. Since December 2019, and more than 4.5 years from the last general election, what followed has seen global pandemic, Russian invasion of Ukraine, October the 7th, the worst mass terror attack in Israel's history, followed by Israel's war against Hamas in Gaza.
And on top of that as well, a cost of living crisis as well.
Incredible.
So, I mean, no one, I think, could have foresaw when Boris Johnson won that historic landslide back in December 2019, how the world would look 4.5 years later, which is having a big impact so far in this general election. We see, for example, that the Conservative Party have been in toil with 3 prime ministers during this parliamentary term. We've seen a reformed Labour Party under the leadership of Keir Starmer that, according to the polls, is on course for its biggest election win in history. So let's just remind ourselves of how we got here when Rishi Sunak took over the reins of being Prime Minister back in October of 2022. And this gives context to where we are now in July 2024.
While Rishi Sunak will be the first Hindu Prime Minister of Great Britain, that's been almost a non-issue in a nation in desperate need of a competent leader.
Prime Minister.
Sunak is the 5th Prime Minister in the past 6 years, and there's hope that this one will succeed.
I think financially knows what he's doing to run the country.
He will be able to sort us out. I think he's been in the right sort of jobs to understand all the intricacies of what needs to be done.
You do need somebody who's going to have courage to change everything and to shake everything up.
Rishi Sunak is described as a proud Hindu who has taken the oath as a member of Parliament on the Hindu holy book, the Bhagavad Gita. As finance minister, Sunak lit candles outside number 10 Downing Street for the Hindu festival of Diwali. He's the wealthiest leader in the democratic world. He and his wife are worth around $1 billion. Sunak has voiced strong support for Israel, saying Jerusalem is undisputably the historic capital of the Jewish state, and there's a very strong case for moving Britain's embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. He is also opposed to the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement against Israel, and has spoken out strongly against anti-Semitism. As for the United States, there are strong ties. Sunak met his wife as a student at Stanford University, and he held a U.S. green card until last year. Sunak's experience at Goldman Sachs in helping run a hedge fund will be useful, as he inherits an economic mess of high inflation, low growth, and soaring energy prices. Some citizens are refusing to pay their utility bills. And when his predecessor, Liz Truss, offered what some believe was a good plan to revive the economy, the markets bucked against it, and the pound crashed to a record low.
It is just very, very difficult for anyone to both reassure the markets and deliver growth at this point. The two are working against each other.
If elections were held today in Britain, the Conservative Party would be wiped out. A recent poll showed the Labour Party holding a 33-point lead. Sunak has 2 years to turn that around and fix Britain's problems before the next election.
As long as he can muster a majority in a vote of confidence in the House of Commons, he will stay as Prime Minister. As to whether he can survive that, again, governments depend on the confidence only of one thing, which is not the opinion polls or even the markets, but the votes in the House of Commons.
Sunak is described as the least unpopular leader of a very unpopular party. And at 42, he's the youngest Prime Minister since Lord Liverpool in 1812. Dale Hurd, CBN News.
Well, so much has happened in that tenure. That video from CBN was there for us in 2022, just announcing what situation Rishi was stepping into. Now, with almost 2 years of being Prime Minister, we have seen him deal with some of those challenges, I think, as effectively as he could have done. He went into a situation as described there as being very unpopular, a very unpopular party, and perhaps the most popular or the least unpopular of an unpopular list of candidates. That was not at all the case 5 years ago when the Tories swept the board. They gained seats that they had never had before under the charismatic leadership of Boris Johnson. But he entered into a mess post-COVID. People were disillusioned already with a lot of the deception, the lies of Partygate. Who can forget some of what happened there? There was so much toxicity within the Conservative Party, a lot of infighting, a lot of backbiting, and a lot of people, even those who would say that they are Conservatives, those who would say that they are Tories in their hearts in some way, have jumped ship and abandoned and are announcing openly their plans to vote for other parties. We've seen some Tory MPs defect over to Labour. We've seen others say they're going to be supporting reform. Other long-standing MPs have said, we're not going to be running again.
And also, yeah, exactly, some very, very high-profile members of Parliament, including cabinet ministers, said that they won't stand at this election. I think Michael Gove is one of them. And that's because I think it's become very tough and it's become very difficult to be a member of Parliament now. And it's been very difficult for the Conservative Party, primarily because they ran out of steam. However, we do need to give credit where credit's due, and that's Rishi Sunak has steered the economy. Inflation has come down, and having been to France recently and comparing the costs here compared to France, we're much better off in this country than they are in France. That probably speaks for a lot of European countries, but that's not enough to win your election. You've got to give vision, hope, and kind of leadership. The one thing I hasn't changed since that news report back in October 2022 from our friends at CBN is the fact that Labour still polling on the same percentage. We know that polls can be wrong, but it very much looks like that poll projection is right. But do you want to talk now and discuss a little bit about how the Jewish community are going to be impacted by this general election and how they probably will vote, and will it be in line with the rest of the country?
Yeah, absolutely, Simon. It's very, very important that we consider this, and I do think that people are in some ways naive in their thinking that, okay, well, any alternative to the Conservatives is going to be better than what we have. That's not necessarily the case. Some Jewish political commentators have argued, because of the horrors of October 7th, that many Jewish people would vote for the Conservative Party on the way that the government has supported Israel and its record on combating anti-Semitism. The Institute for Jewish Research Policy has published the results of their polling that shows support for Labour is at 46% and the Conservatives are on 30%. Support for the Conservatives is higher than the national average. The community is concerned about raising Jewish hatred and Israel, but also health, education, and the cost of living, as with anyone else. Liberal and progressives within the Jewish community tend to vote Labour or Lib Dem. Those who attend synagogue tend to vote Conservative, according to the IJRP. There are concerns, though, widespread concerns, if Labour gets elected and recognizes an independent Palestinian state, ban arms sales to Israel, and turns a blind eye to the BDS movement, the ramifications of that for the Jewish community. So with a lot of votes also being carved away from both Conservatives and probably Labour to some degree, going to Lib Dems, going to the Greens even more in favour of an independent Palestinian state. There will, I believe, be some seats that go to the Green Party in this election. You know, we could even consider the Workers' Party and talk about their track record. And we, of course, have George Galloway with a seat from that by-election. Okay, yes, it was because things went quite pear-shaped for Labour in that constituency, and it was discovered that their candidate had expressed anti-Semitic views. But are they going to be able to pull through in this particular election? Any seats?
I mean, there's a big difference between a by-election and a general election. In a by-election, you're not voting for the government, and if you want to put a protest vote into the government and put your message out, you can through a protest vote. But when it comes to a general election, people are not willing to kind of risk their own financial future on a risky political party or risky political candidate. So they will do some serious thinking about who is in the best interest to provide for me economically, who will govern the economy better, am I likely to be richer and better off under a particular party, or do I care about health and the NHS? Will that affect my vote? As Christians, we look at the morality of the political parties. Where do they stand on big life and moral issues such as abortion, euthanasia, etc.? We'll determine how we vote on that one. But for me personally, and looking at whether our nation is blessed or cursed, Israel has to be a huge consideration in how we vote, and certainly will be a huge consideration of mine when you look at the policies represented in the political manifestos of each party and how they stand on Israel and its impact on the Jewish community here. So I think this is a central theme. But the Institute for Jewish Policy Research has come up with a fascinating survey carried out in mid-June. So it says here that the research panel provides the research infrastructure to gather nationally representatives data about Jewish behaviours and attitudes on a wide range of social and political issues. This paper presents primarily data on voting intentions for July 2024 based on 2,717 Jewish adults who responded to the 2024 Jewish Current Affairs Survey between the 14th and the 20th of June 2024. So this is what they say. They say that 46% of Jews in the UK tend to vote for the Labour Party compared to 42% amongst the general population. And I think that has a lot to do with the perception that Keir Starmer has reformed the Labour Party. He's rid the party of its hardline anti-Semites, including that of Jeremy Corbyn. And for the Jewish community, the Labour Party is their natural party of choice for many members of the Jewish community. So the fact is they've got a new leadership. They also see that Keir Starmer's married to a Jewish woman, which means that he understands our interests. He's married to a Jewish person. He observes Shabbat on a Friday night. So therefore, he understands our dilemmas. He understands the challenges facing the Jewish community. Therefore, we think it's safe to vote for him. Also says that 30% of Jews in the UK tend to vote for the Conservative Party, compared to 22% in the general British population.
Reform UK has attracted 6% of Jewish voters compared to 15% nationally, so it's not split the right-leaning vote among Jews to the same extent as it has among the UK population as a whole. When Conservative and Reform UK votes are combined, the percentage of right-leaning votes among Jews, 36%, is not significantly different to that found among the general population of the country, 37%. But there are significant differences in Jewish people's voting intentions by denomination, with the more traditional and Orthodox Jews much more likely to lean conservative, and the progressive and unaffiliated Jews much more likely to lean Labour. Young Jewish voters are much more likely than their elders to prefer a party other than Labour, Conservative, or the Liberal Democrats. Data gathered during the current parliament show that support for the Labour Party among Jews has bounced back from an all-time low 11% support in the 2019 general election when Jeremy Corbyn led the party. Jews in the UK, however, are prone to vote for one of the two large parties than the general UK population, with 10% supporting the Green Party, compared with 6% in the general population, 8% supporting the Liberal Democrats, that's 11% of the general population, 6% supporting Reform UK, 15% the general population, and under 1% supporting the SNP or Plaid Cymru, 3% general population.
Wide Cymru. You have to pick up on your else.
Yeah,
Now, one aspect of this general election I think we're going to see for the first time is the influence of what is known as the Red-Green Alliance, the hard left, together with the Islamists, that could have a major impact on this year's general election and the results that follow. So let's have a look at this excellent CBN News report talking about the threats that Israel face, the threats the Jewish community face, and how our democracy faces from this growing and emerging alliance against Israel and the Jewish people, known as the Red-Green Alliance.
A moment of existential crisis. That's how our next guest describes the threat to Israel, the United States, and the world at this pivotal time in history. Robert Stearns is overseeing Bishop of the Tabernacle Church of Buffalo. He heads Eagle's Wings. That's a ministry that builds bridges between Christians and Jews. And he's author of the new book, Rise and Rebuild, a guide to overcoming adversity. Bishop Stearns, it's good to have you here in Virginia Beach with us. What don't Christians, even Christians, people in the church, what don't they understand about Israel?
What we don't understand about Israel is that there are twin forces, two forces that pose an existential threat to our way of life, the Judeo-Christian worldview, the basic liberties and freedoms that the West cherishes. And those twin threats are radicalized Islam and far-left militant secularism. And bizarrely, these two forces, militant secularism and radical Islam, are now colluding together against the Jewish state of Israel and against the Jewish people worldwide. Every time we look at history, we see that what starts with the Jews does not end with the Jews. They call Israel the little Satan. They call America and the West the big Satan.
It's not just Iran that says that.
Absolutely not. Iran sends its message of hate and vitriol and jihad and genocide all throughout the world. And we see alliances with Qatar. We see Hamas, Hezbollah, Syria, all of this evil encroaching upon this tiny Jewish state.
And we've seen this rising anti-Semitism on our college campuses, and even the White House is lukewarm in the relationship with Israel, maybe at times even hostile. So what's happening? How has that happened?
Well, it's happened because the church has bought into something called replacement theology that essentially says that God's covenant with Israel is over, God's done with the Jews, and the church is the new Israel, the church is the new Jews. Well, that's not what the Bible teaches. The Bible tells us clearly in the book of Romans that Christians have been grafted into God's covenant with the Jewish people, and that God's covenant with Abraham endures. God says, as long as the sun and moon are in place, this is how strong my covenant is. Last time I checked, the sun and the moon are still lighting up our world. And so when we begin to assault the character of God, which is what replacement theology is. Replacement theology is an assault on the character of God. It's saying, God, you don't keep your promises. You don't keep your covenants. When you do that, you chip away at the foundation of our faith. And the foundation of America and the West is our Judeo-Christian worldview.
So it's really a spiritual battle right now that we're in.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Without question.
And Eagle's Wings, you just returned from a trip to Israel where you had 32 pastors join you.
That's right.
What did they learn? What did they come to understand that they didn't know before they went there?
Well, Eagle's Wings has made it our mission to identify young, emerging pastors and bring them to Israel. Because for so many pastors, the trip to Israel is a bucket list item that they want to do sometime in their life, and they end up doing it in their late 60s, their early 70s, and you've lost 40 years of their ministerial career, 40 years of sermons and of influence over that congregation. So we scholarship young pastors, we bring them to Israel. And what we have found overwhelmingly is that they come back and they say, this is nothing at all like what the media portrays.
Oh, so it's all about moral clarity and making that connection of our faith. Right?
You know, in the late 30s, as Hitler rose to power in Germany, before Nazism took a hold, there was a courageous pastor named Dietrich Bonhoeffer. And Dietrich Bonhoeffer went to the 18,000 churches in Germany. There were 18,000 churches as Hitler rose to power. And he appealed to those churches to stand against this rising tide of evil. Tragically, only 3,000 churches stood with Bonhoeffer. 15,000 churches, some of them actually sided with Hitler, but the majority of them, 12,000 churches, said, we can't get involved politically. This is outside our realm of spiritual discourse. And what happened was the tragedy of Nazi Germany, the tragedy of the Holocaust. How many lives were lost? How many human lives were lost?
Is it being repeated now?
I am sobered to say, I believe we're in a Bonhoeffer moment. And if the church does not wake up, I believe it will be too late.
And you've always said it's not just enough to pray. We can pray for the peace of Jerusalem. We need to get actively involved. How can we get involved?
We can get involved in several ways. Prayer is the beginning point, and I don't want to underestimate the power of prayer. It's powerful, it's crucial. But the second thing is you have to get educated. You have to understand what happened in 1948. What happened in 1967? What are all of these wars that Israel has faced? The reality is Israel's been at war since 48. I mean, there's a brief respite here and a brief, pause there, but attack after attack. Why? This isn't about the creation of a Palestinian state. Israel has offered a two-state solution over and over and over again.
I always tell people Gaza was a two-state. They had their own administration for 20 years.
I was with Prime Minister Sharon in his office about 6 weeks before he made that decision to withdraw from Gaza, and we were discussing that momentous decision. Gaza could have become, the Singapore of the Middle East. It could have become a beautiful, flourishing city. What happened?
Billions for tunnels.
Billions for tunnels.
And rockets.
Not to build schools, not to build up a society. And so what happens is we interpret that Middle East situation through a Western lens. And we say, well, surely all Hamas wants is peace. No, Hamas doesn't want peace. Hamas wants the genocide of the Jewish people, the obliteration of the state of Israel.
Okay, the book is Rise and Rebuild, A Guide to Overcoming Adversity. Bishop Robert Stearns, thank you for being with us.
It's great to be with you today. Thank you,
Appreciate
brother.
you being here in Virginia Beach.
An honor.
And we have a special guest joining us for this week's Behind the Headlines. His name is Michael McMahon. He's the former director of Israel-Britain Alliance and a former Labour Member of Parliament. Michael, it's always a pleasure that you can join us on Behind the Headlines from Glasgow. But what are your thoughts on this general election as we're literally days away from polling day? And why is the issue of Israel such a crucial election for the major political parties?
Well, our generation, Simon, has never seen Israel facing an existential threat like the one that took place on the 7th of October 2023. 3 generations ago, people witnessed the War of Independence. A couple of generations ago, people would have witnessed the 7-Day War. But we've never seen Israel attacked in such a scale. Obviously, we know Iran was behind it, pulling all the strings, but we've never witnessed it before. So we've seen violence, we've seen regular threats, but we've never seen an existential threat. So this general election and the people who will be elected will have to decide whether they're going to stand up for Israel or whether they're going to appease terrorists. That's a choice.
Michael, so the Labour Party, if the polls are correct, are on course to completely wipe out the Tories in this next election. Keir Starmer, as Prime Minister, share with us your perspective on how a possible Labour government will interact with the Jewish state.
Well, I fear for the future. What will happen initially will be all very calm and quiet, and people will be saying the same things that they've said for several months now, which is calling for a ceasefire, and they will be making more requests for humanitarian aid to be sent to those in need. And it's right that we send aid to those in need in a war zone. But what will happen very quickly is that the Labour Party will default to its standard position, which there will be the people behind the scenes, the real hard left who are still there, and the people who are soft supporters of the position of appeasing terrorists and appeasing Palestinian terrorists in particular, will start to come out the woodwork, and they will press the Labour Party, which will then, we expect, will be the government of the United Kingdom, to take more radical measures, which will include an immediate recognition of a Palestinian state, despite the fact they will not have solved the problems of security, borders, and all the other issues like right of return, all those things. None of that will be resolved, but they will want the British state to recognise a Palestinian state, which will not work. And the bottom line is the terrorists will get what they want, because for those viewers who remember the IRA tactics, which was to continually ask the other side to make concessions without offering any concessions of your own, that's exactly what the Palestinians have learned. They will offer no concessions whatsoever, and we will go down this spiraling disaster of a route forward, which will be a continuation of the violence. The terrorists will get bolder because they know that the people who they need to convince, which will be the British state, the British government, will capitulate to every demand that they make.
Michael, are we going to see in this general election, really for the first time, the influence of the Muslim vote on the general election, and in particular how they rally behind the Palestinian cause? And what impact do you think that this will have, not only on the outcome of the election, but also any possible future government and its policies towards Israel and the conflict in Gaza?
100%, Simon. The position is, look, lobbying politicians or lobbying people who wish to become politicians is nothing new. But the difference is, in the circumstances that we face, is that we've got mobs rampaging down our streets, threatening people with violence unless you agree with them. And if you don't, then they want to harm you. And so it's perfectly normal for trade unions, for other organisations that stick up for civil rights and who believe in different things in life, to put forward their views and ask the would-be politicians to support their cause. But this is different. That's always within the context of Britain, the UK, what we stand for, what we believe in. My real concern is that it's not just the Palestinian cause that they want you to support, irrespective of looking at any of the detail and delineating the facts from the fiction and the truth from lies. They actually want to destroy the way we live in our country. We're giving them the freedom to destroy or potentially destroy our freedoms. And that's the danger in this election. We already have politicians who have privately said to me that they support Israel, but they'll say something completely different in front of their constituents and the camera, because they know that those people will be crucial in getting them elected. And that's a dangerous, dangerous place where we are in 2024 Britain.
What is the Conservative policy position towards Israel, and do you see some disconnect between the attitudes of our Prime Minister Rishi Sunak and David Cameron in their attitudes toward Israel in the wake of the 7th of October attacks?
Well, first of all, there should be unequivocal support for Israel, because let's put it into context. If the same amount of Brits had been killed in a terror attack, in a single terror attack, it would have equated to nearly 10,000 people. If you put the ratio of the people killed in Israel on the 7th of October 2023, and if you assimilate that to the figures of the British population, roughly 65, 67 million, 10,000 people would have been killed in the same day. What do you think the British reaction would have been to that? We have the Conservative Party, which does support Israel. The only other party which is stronger than the Conservative Party will be the Unionist parties in Northern Ireland. And the situation, which should have been continuing unequivocal support for Israel, that has not happened. David Cameron became the Foreign Secretary, and as usual, he has diluted the Conservative policies. Rishi Sunak has remained strong, but the two of them have been saying two entirely different things. And there's a real imbalance there where Rishi Sunak couldn't really attack or bring David Cameron to heel because he just recently appointed him as the Foreign Secretary. So the Conservative Party, while still being, in general terms, there's some people within that party who do not support Israel, but in general terms are very supportive of Israel. That has been watered down by David Cameron. But I'm afraid, gentlemen, we don't have very long to wait till I doubt we're going to have David Lammy as the Foreign Secretary. He's just too much of a loose cannon for Keir Starmer to be able to handle. So watch this space. You'll have heard it here first. I suspect that Douglas Alexander, who's standing for a seat in East Lothian in Scotland, will be elected come Thursday, and he will be the go-to person as the Foreign Secretary. Much, much better than David Lammy, but Douglas Alexander will still have to contend with his party behind him in Parliament, who will not be supporting a strong position on Israel.
And Michael, can you just explain to us why the liberal progressive parties such as the Liberal Democrats or even worse the Green Party are just absolutely obsessed with this whole concept of a Palestinian state and the Palestinian cause, knowing that Israel is the only democratic nation in the Middle East, knowing that Israel is the one that invents green technology and is actually blessing the world. And yet, when you look at the political manifestos of the Liberal Democrats, but more in particular the Green Party, they are so hostile to Israel. Can you explain why?
Well, these are parties that are never going to be elected as a UK government, Simon, and the Liberal Democrats are a rump or party which is supported by an even smaller rump of individuals in society. Never going to be elected. Their policies don't matter. The only fear factor would be if they form part of a coalition. And in terms of the Greens are so extreme that once again they're never going to be elected. So we'll hear their voices, but they're unlikely to have any significant effect.
Michael, we've seen a lot of gravitation toward the Reform Party, a lot of people jumping ship from the Conservatives in kind of a protest vote. Well, we've also seen Reform candidates being accused of anti-Semitic comments in recent days, on top of other things. What are your thoughts if Reform was to gain any seats? What would their outlook be on Israel?
Well, I think I wouldn't know, because I think it's there's such a disparate group that it's actually candidate by candidate you'd have to examine in terms of working out where they stand. Nigel Farage has imploded to a certain extent. I think his comments on Putin were extremely unwise. I think blaming a vetting company on what candidates you have is rather weak as well, because the bottom line is it just demonstrates they've been in existence for such a short space of time that they don't have any gravitas behind them. I like Nigel Farage. He's jocular, he's funny. I'm sure he'd be a great guy if you meet him down the pub for a pint, but I wouldn't trust him as a politician because I don't think he has any of the answers. All he can give us are the problems.
And Michael, finally, just share with our viewers why it's so important, particularly those who love Israel and love the Jewish people during this very turbulent time, that they look at the political manifestos of all the major political parties before they actually decide to vote, and also the importance of voting on Thursday, the 4th of July, which is tomorrow.
Well, as we have said many, many times, Simon, the state of Israel is a great nation for its history, for its contribution to the world, and for everything it does and the contributions it makes to our daily lives. We have great friends over in Israel. They will be loyal allies to us as a country, and we should be loyal allies to them.
Yep. Michael, we just want to thank you so much for joining us on Behind the Headlines. If you were standing in this general election, you certainly win my vote.
Thank you very much. I'll consider that the next time round.
Well, thankful so much for the very helpful, valuable insights there from Michael McCann. It's so important that we be thinking through this, not just on we're upset by what's happened in the past 5 years view or perspective, or even what's gone on in other administrations previously. We need to be thinking much bigger picture, looking at where the support is, particularly for Israel. This could have absolutely catastrophic impact on our nation, but also on the relationship that we have as a nation with Israel and the years to come if we go down the wrong road.
Absolutely, and we need to see this general election through the lens of October the 7th, knowing that not only Israel changed on October the 7th, but also the world changed after the worst mass terrorist attack by Hamas that was committed on Saturday, the 7th of October, the biggest genocide in Israel's history, the biggest genocide in one single day against the Jewish people since the Holocaust during the Second World War. And we're also seeing how the Palestinian cause is mobilizing the Muslim community. Sadly, we're seeing that they are rallying behind the Palestinian cause to such an extent that we're now seeing this alliance between the hard left and the Islamists. And for the first time, I think, in our nation's history, we could well see the full impact of that. And there could be some surprises that come up as the election unfolds and the results come in. But it's important, as we discuss this in this program, who you should vote for. It's important to look at the party political manifesto. So I'll kick off with the Conservative Party. So we say that they say that they will continue to pursue free trade agreements with countries such as Israel and Switzerland. We staunchly stand by Israel's right to defend itself and to live in security. We will continue to support access to aid for those affected by the conflict. They go on to say that we will push for a two-state solution in the Middle East. Our long-standing position has been that we recognise a Palestinian state at a time that is most conducive to the peace process, but that's a long way away. They also say abuse and discrimination based on religion is unacceptable. We will not tolerate anti-Semitic hatred in any form. We have pledged 54 million for the Community Security Trust to give Jewish schools and synagogues the security measures they need, and allocated additional funding to support schools and universities to understand and recognise and tackle anti-Semitism. And they will get the UK Holocaust Memorial built, which is most likely to be outside of the Houses of Parliament.
Should have already been built. They're going to bring back our bill to ban public bodies from imposing their own boycott or divestment campaigns against foreign countries and territories. Also, they promise we will place a duty on the police and prosecutors to publish regular guidance on the statements, chants, or symbols, for example, the swastika or the term jihad, that in the context of political protest may constitute an offence. The government will also explore ways for authorities to recover some of the costs of policing disruptive protests from the groups that organise them, it adds. The Conservative government's foreign policy has been driven by David Cameron, the Foreign Secretary, and he has called for a Palestinian state and for Israel's war against Hamas to stop.
Yeah, and we mentioned earlier with Michael this disconnect between Rishi Sunak, the Prime Minister, and that of his Foreign Secretary, David Cameron.
And so many.
And also many of these things that the Conservative Party have put in their election manifesto all sound very good, but they've been in power since 2010. They've been in power since when October the 7th occurred, and they didn't respond to this then, despite the callings of their Home Secretary then, Suella Braverman, calling for tougher measures. They weren't implemented. They put this in the election manifesto, but the big question is, can they deliver?
Yep, and what we're going to have to see, each individual candidate is going to have particular views, and that's why I think it's so important that those who are considering who to vote for actually look into all of the options that are in front of them and assess where each of the individual local candidates for their constituency stand.
I mean, on Israel and the Jewish community, this manifesto sounds good. However, I'm very concerned that the Conservative Party want to push for a Palestinian state, but they are not pushing for a unilateral Palestinian state. They say when the conditions are right in the peace process, they will advance and push towards a Palestinian state. Looking at the Labour Party manifesto, Labour has pledged to continue to push for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza, which is against Israel's interests. They said that they want the release of all hostages, and we all agree with that. They want the upholding of international law and the rapid increase to aid into Gaza. I say that long-term peace and security in the Middle East will be an immediate focus. Labour will continue to push for an immediate ceasefire, the release of all the hostages, the upholding of international law, the rapid increase into aid into Gaza. Palestinian statehood is an inalienable right of the Palestinian people. It is not the gift of any neighbour and is also essential to the long-term security of Israel. And they also say that we recommend recognising a Palestinian state as a contribution to renewed peace process which results in a two-state solution.
And they desire there to be a safe and secure Israel, along a viable and sovereign Palestinian state as part of that. Now, Keir Starmer's statements that Hamas can have no further role in the governance of Palestine and David Lammy's repeated pledges to ban the IRGC also underline that a changed Labour Party knows that terrorism and extremism represent the most serious threat to long-term peace and stability and the region. Jake Wallace-Simons writes in the Daily Telegraph, today Labour is facing mounting pressure from British Muslims to shift to an anti-Israel position, with Angela Rayner and John Ashworth both running against pro-Gaza candidates in their seats. Rayner was even caught on camera saying her party would, quote, recognise Palestine, end quote, and rebuild Gaza. This was grubby electioneering, trading recognition of Palestine for Muslim votes. Sir Keir has made a point of purging his party of its Corbynite rump, but voters will look at this manifesto pledge and they're going to worry that the tail still wags the dog. The sectarianism that has formed British society, both in northern constituencies and on the streets of London on Saturdays, has its deepest hooks in Labour. Capitulation may buy a measure of party unity, but at what cost?
Yeah, no, I think Keir Starmer deserves a lot of credit for stamping out the really extreme anti-Semitic elements within his party, but how much has he caved into the Islamists? How much has his party then wanted to cultivate the Muslim vote at this general election? And what impact will that have on British foreign policy towards Israel? Only time will tell if they win the general election tomorrow on Thursday, the 4th of July, will we actually fully know. Moving on to the Liberal Democrats. In the Liberal Democrats manifesto, they say they advocate for an immediate bilateral ceasefire in the Israel-Gaza conflict to resolve the humanitarian catastrophe in Gaza, get the hostages out, provide the space to reach a two-state solution based on the 1967 borders with security and dignity for the Israelis and the Palestinians, work with our allies to help bring security and stability in the Middle East, which has become a tinderbox amidst the Israel-Gaza conflict, including advocating for an immediate bilateral ceasefire in Israel and Gaza conflict, recognizing that there are no military solutions to remove Hamas from Gaza. So I don't know how the Liberal Democrats intend to have an immediate ceasefire and saying there's no way to defeat Hamas militarily. So what does Israel do with Hamas in Gaza, knowing they've killed and murdered 1,200 of their citizens, taken 250 back as hostages, and now there's only about 113 left. Also knowing, for example, there were over 7,000 that were injured, and if Israel doesn't take out Hamas in Gaza, then this poses an existential threat to Israel's existence.
Well, my local hustings, the Lib Dem candidate, who was represented by the neighbouring constituency's candidate, indicated very clearly that they don't believe in any military solution, that they believe there's only a political solution, but there was no substance to what that would look like. And there was no recognition that for many years political solutions have been sought. And again, even in this conflict, we've also seen political solutions, and it's been in Hamas's court, and routinely they've disagreed with. And
in their election manifesto, they also want to officially recognise an independent state of Palestine with immediate effect. Good note on Iran, though, recognising the existential threat of Iran, not just in the Middle East, but to the Western democracies by prescribing the Iranian Revolutionary Guards, upholding and respecting international courts and international law. Well, they're good on Iran. They also want to work with the communities to tackle the rise of anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. Now, onto the Reform Party. Now, the Reform Party's manifesto makes no mention of Israel or anything related. The statement says that they promises a major review into the effectiveness of overseas aid that could apply to aid to the Palestinian territories. The draft manifesto originally stated to enforce existing laws to stop violent hate demonstrations such as the Free Palestine marches. However, this was not included in the final manifesto. So I think
there's reasons.
All Reform UK Party have done is wanting to uphold freedom of speech, but to also tackle and confront the anti-Israel mob at these pro-Palestinian rallies?
Well, I think the reality is there are people who are a part of Reform Party UK who themselves are anti-Semites. And as Michael McMahon said, it's such a disparate collection of people. They're individuals. There's no consensus of this in the Reform Party UK, which is concerning. The Green Party has been calling for an immediate bilateral ceasefire in the war between Israel and Gaza and the return of hostages since mid-October 2023. In fact, my local running candidate said that they began calling for this, but acknowledged before Israel had even responded in any way. They began plans for this from the 8th. We condemned the appalling murder of hundreds of Israeli civilians by Hamas on 7th of October, for which Hamas should be held to account. Since then, I've watched in horror as Israeli forces have committed war crimes that have caused the death of tens of thousands of Palestinian civilians. That's without any evidence or proof,
Exactly.
And without recognition of the evidence and proofs that are there to the contrary. Immediate and permanent bilateral ceasefire, durable political solution is what they're seeking, recognition of the state of Palestine, and under urgent international effort to end what they call the illegal occupation of Palestinian land, investigation and prosecution of war crimes, which they believe have been happening, as well as support for South Africa's submission to the International Court of Justice that Israel is guilty of genocide in its conduct in Gaza, an end to all UK arms exports to and military cooperation with Israel. So, sounding out saying Hamas should be held to account. Well, then Hamas is being held to account. No, not that way. Okay, what way? How is Hamas going to be held to account outside of this?
Yeah, they also say that they want to end all UK arms exports, to end the military cooperation with Israel. And nothing to mention the fact that Israel is one of the leading countries when it comes to inventing green technology, their innovation, their research, their scientific development. Nothing mentioned that from the Green Party. So in summing up, I think what we have to do is look at the impact of these policies, and if these parties win the next general election, which is only tomorrow, where you get the opportunity to vote who you decide you want to form our next government, has a huge implication when we look at Genesis chapter 12 verses 1 to 3. So the New King James Version says, now the Lord said to Abram, get out of your country, from your family and from your father's house, to a land that I will show you. I will make you a great nation. I will bless you and make your name great, and you shall be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and I will curse him who curses you. And in you, all the families of the earth shall be blessed. So the issue of Israel is so critical to understanding whether our nation receives a blessing or a curse from God, whether our nation is in darkness or it's in light, in the light regarding righteousness because of our nation's stance on Israel. And this should be a major factor when it comes to deciding what cross to put in the ballot box come tomorrow.
Well, most definitely should. And yet, Simon, I've seen already where individuals who are Christians are saying, well, anything will be better than a particular party, and they're not considering this at all. It's mostly what people are looking at as promises regarding the economy, promises regarding taxes, which always will vary and will always have varying levels of success.
But this has a huge impact, not only our society, but also our economy as well. It depends whether we live in darkness or whether we live in light.
It's about the spiritual element.
Whether there's a rise of evil in this country, right, and our nation is overtaken by tyranny and evil, because that's what happens when we don't stand up for Israel and the Jewish people.
People don't see the interrelation between this and even things like illegal immigration. They don't see how this also relates to rising Islamicization as well. It's deeply concerning, but we need to search the scriptures, we need to apply them, and we need to vote according to what is best for the nation in this regard.
Reagan, great program. Thank you very much. And I want to thank you for watching home. We are on the eve of a general election, and it's your choice to actually vote tomorrow in our general election. I just want you to consider one thing, that Israel is a major factor in determining the destiny of our nation. Whether we are blessed as a nation or whether we are cursed as a nation depends on whether we stand with Israel or the Jewish people. Do your research, read the political manifestos of the major political parties before casting your vote. So thank you for watching this week's edition of Behind the Headlines.